abertos os trabalhos, eu queria falar sobre a sessão de abertura, que vai apresentar como a tecnologia influencia os rumos do investimento social privado. Todos ouvimos falar muito sobre as grandes evoluções tecnológicas, seu impacto na vida das pessoas, mas qual o potencial de contribuição dessas transformações para quem investe recursos buscando soluções para os grandes problemas sociais e ambientais? Essas contribuições podem ser positivas. Como isso impacta a atuação de nós, investidores sociais? E quais são as novidades que nos esperam, com potencial de provocar cada vez mais mudanças? A ideia é provocar reflexão sobre esses caminhos pelos quais a tecnologia promoverá ou não o desenvolvimento justo e sustentável da nossa sociedade, e quais os espaços que a filantropia pode ocupar. E, com isso, eu gostaria de chamar ao palco Rhodri Davies, meu colega da CAF. Rhodri? Rhodri estuda esse tema há um bom tempo e é um grande conhecedor de como a filantropia e a tecnologia podem se ajudar e onde a tecnologia e a filantropia se encontram. Rhodri.
Thank you, Paula. Hello, bom dia. I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much to the Brazilian Philanthropy Forum and to IDIS in particular for inviting me to speak to you today. My apologies also that I'm not able to talk to you in Portuguese. It did strike me just now thinking about technology that actually developments in live translation software might in a very few years' time make this not a problem anymore, but unfortunately I'm a few years too early. So I'm here today to talk to you about where philanthropy and technology meet. I want to start first of all by saying something about why I think it is that they have to meet. So technology is not just moving fast anymore, but accelerating. As I think was demonstrated very clearly by the excellent musical performance that we've just had. Technology is already playing an enormous role in all of our lives, and it's affecting the ways in which we work, we learn, and we interact with one another. So I don't think that it's necessarily a choice anymore about whether we engage with technology, but more a question of how we do it. And I want to suggest 3 ways that we can start off thinking about this. Technology. Right. So in terms of that question of what the approach could be, I find it useful to frame it in 3 ways. The first one, the most positive, is to think of the potential for technology to offer new ways of achieving social and environmental good or delivering on your mission. And I think we will hear more later on today about some great examples of this idea of tech for good. The second way is to think about the wider impact on civil society, philanthropy, and the organizations that work within it. And I'm thinking here of the way it will change financial infrastructure, legislation, regulation, and the ways in which people are able to give to causes. And then finally, I think it's important that we acknowledge the negative side of technology and the way in which technology is already starting to create new challenges of the sorts that civil society and philanthropy will have to address in the future. And before I go on to speak about each of these in a bit more detail, I just want to say something about what I'm talking about when I talk about technology here. Obviously, the internet and social media are huge factors in the news, and they are having a very determinate effect on our lives. But a lot of the work that I have done has focused on what might be coming slightly further ahead in terms of emerging and potentially disruptive technology. So some examples of the sorts of things that I mean here are up on this slide. And I just want to take 2 of these that I've worked on particularly over the last 4 or 5 years and say a bit more about them briefly, because I think that will help frame what I'm going to say. So first of all, I want to take artificial intelligence Up front, I think it's important to say I don't actually think artificial intelligence is necessarily a very helpful phrase. I think it connotes in a lot of people's minds the idea of human-level intelligence across the board of the sort you can see there in the film Blade Runner. But actually, we're nowhere near that today. What is really being talked about when people talk about artificial intelligence is the use of algorithms, so decision-making processes encoded in computers and software, to do a very narrow range of tasks extremely well, up to human-level capability or far beyond it. And we can see this in sort of trivial areas like playing games like Go and chess, but increasingly we're seeing it in real-world contexts like image recognition, facial recognition, and natural language conversation. And it's crucial, I think, to point out that the reason that we are hearing so much about artificial intelligence now is due to a change in the nature of the algorithms that are involved. Traditionally, if you wanted to program an algorithm to do something, you would have to know all of the rules that governed that algorithm. And that was a huge limiting factor, because there are many things that human beings are very good at doing and are extremely bad at explaining how we do. For instance, recognizing faces, recognizing images, just talking normally. The difference with machine learning is that the algorithms start off almost as a blank canvas and are able to analyze huge amounts of data and learn for themselves how to do these things. So we don't necessarily any longer need to know what all the rules are. And this has opened up huge new areas for development in terms of things like image recognition and facial recognition, which now are possible. And the other technology that I want to briefly say something about, and it is quite difficult to say anything brief but meaningful about blockchain, is blockchain, an area I've been working on for about 5 years now. It's a very technical thing to talk about and quite difficult to even explain in simple terms, but I will try. Essentially, what we're talking about, for anybody who's never heard of it before, is a way of keeping records. So blockchain is about distributed public ledgers. So it's a way of keeping records of transaction and ownership and value within a system. But the crucial difference between blockchain and what's gone before is you no longer need to have a trusted third party in the middle to maintain the record. It's distributed across all of the people using the system. And that opens up some very interesting possibilities. It is important to say many people, if they have heard of it, will have heard of blockchain in the context of cryptocurrency, which is still the best known use case, and particularly Bitcoin, but they are not the same things. The applications of blockchain potentially go far wider. And without saying anything really about how the underlying technology works, I want to just highlight a few of the key features that I think make it very interesting for civil society and philanthropy. So firstly, as I've mentioned, it's distributed. So rather than having central points of authority, the system is maintained across all of the users, and that opens up interesting possibilities. It's immutable in that information put on a blockchain is very difficult to change after the fact. That makes it potentially highly secure. It does also raise some challenges. Blockchains are public. There's a question mark because increasingly there are private blockchains as well, and that's an area of some controversy. But originally the idea was that anyone who wanted to could look at the whole ledger, download a copy and see all of the information on it, so it's highly transparent. And they also allow for interesting things like tokenization, which is where you can create digital objects that are able to represent different types of assets or value, whether that's physical assets like a diamond or the contents of a container ship, or entirely intangible things like intellectual property in the music industry or social value. And there are projects doing all of those things. And then they also lend themselves to a high degree of automation, particularly through the use of things called smart contracts, which are self-executing computer programs that can sit on top of the blockchain and do very clever things that previously would have required all sorts of people like lawyers to execute. So it's a bit of a threat for the legal industry, it has to be said. So how are some of these technologies being used for good, to take the sort of first area that I highlighted up front? And I just want to give a few examples. You'll hear many more throughout the day, I think, so I won't take too long going through them. In terms of artificial intelligence, there are some extremely interesting projects going on in the philanthropy and civil society world. A lot of focus in terms of what I've seen so far has been around sort of medical research and also the environment, largely, I think, because this is where, at the moment, there is the required amount of data in order to be able to develop these algorithms. But there are some extremely interesting projects doing things like finding ways of detecting disease much earlier through analysing big data using machine learning, or using AI to develop predictive models to try and stop poaching in sub-Saharan Africa. And in terms of blockchain, it's a small field still, admittedly, but there are people out there doing very interesting things, from using the technology to disintermediate financial systems and reduce the cost of moving money around, tokenizing social value, using smart contracts to create payment by results models. And I should flag up that Alice, one of the organizations there, is here today, so you'll be able to hear more from them later on. But I think the point I want to make is the individual technologies are very interesting, but in the future, the real power is going to come from how they interact and converge. And I just want to take one example from some work we did with a sight loss charity in the UK, looking at what the future might hold for them. If you think about somebody with a visual impairment and what technology might mean for them in a few years' time, the possibilities all of a sudden become apparent. So screen reading technology already allows you to take visual information and turn it into audio information. So written words on paper or on a screen are now available to those who suffer from sight loss. The use of conversational assistants like Apple's Siri or Amazon's Alexa means that we're all starting to interact with technology more using our voice than using our vision. And that obviously benefits people for whom vision is a barrier. The development of autonomous vehicles, again, means that people with visual impairment will not necessarily be at a disadvantage when it comes to getting around. Similarly, the development of online virtual spaces in which they can compensate for any visual impairment means they will be able to potentially interact at no disadvantage. Looking slightly further ahead, this is meant to represent the development of direct neural interfaces, something Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook is very interested in, that allow you to directly communicate with a computer. And again, if you bypass that visual element, that could potentially be a great leveler. And then finally, the Internet of Things, so the massive network of smart objects connected to the internet with sensors that are able to adapt and respond to the particular needs of users, could mean that somebody living in a home populated by these objects would find their life much easier in the future. So I think the potential for technology to change the way that we address issues and to help people is clear. But as I said up front, it's also going to have a much wider impact on transforming the operating environment in which civil society and philanthropy organisations work. This is going to happen in all sorts of ways, but I just want to raise a few possibilities of how it might play out. So taking blockchain again from the work that I've done, I want to just give an example of 3 different ways blockchain might have an impact on civil society. The first, as I've said, is through disintermediation, so removing traditional middlemen. This could benefit civil society if you believe that it will make it easier to get assets directly to those in need and reduce the cost of doing it. For instance, getting money to people in the developing world directly rather than through a long chain of middlemen. It also potentially represents a risk if civil society organisations themselves are seen as intermediaries. Another possibility, which I'm sure you will hear more about today as well, is the idea of radical transparency. So blockchain allows you to create digital objects on it that are unique and non-fungible, so they are traceable in a way that's not previously been possible. And when you come to philanthropy, this means that you have the potential for a donor to trace their individual donation on a blockchain all the way through an organisation and out the other end and see how it is spent. this could potentially bring huge benefits in terms of trust in institutions. It also raises some big questions about what information is put on a blockchain and who is able to access it. And then finally, there's the idea of the impact that blockchain will have on governance models. So blockchain, as I've said, is about decentralization. That applies to systems, to markets, and to supply chains, but it also applies equally to individual organizations. And there are things called distributed autonomous organizations, or DAOs, where people are using the blockchain to take all of the elements of existing centralized organizational structures and create instead much looser networks that are bound together by the technology and able to do many of the same things. And this could potentially open up some radical possibilities for civil society. And blockchain, as I've said, is it's a ledger technology. It's about capturing and storing and using data. And this highlights a wider point that I'm sure will be a running theme of the day about the future importance of data. We already are being told a lot that data is the most valuable asset in the world. It's the new oil or the new electricity or whatever you want to say. And I think the question of how data is captured, who owns it, and how it's used is going to be one of the huge defining questions of the next few years. And that will apply to civil society just like any other sector. And I think there are going to be some big challenges for all of us in getting to grips with these questions about how we capture and use data. And one of the reasons that data is going to be so important is that it's the raw material that allows for the development of machine learning. And that brings us back to artificial intelligence. And I just want to say a little bit about one of the ways in which we're already seeing this play out in civil society. So perhaps the most obvious current use of artificial intelligence, or at least the most prominent in our lives, is the use of chatbots and conversational assistants that are powered by artificial intelligence, so Alexa, Siri, Google Home. And these are already being harnessed by civil society and philanthropy in a number of ways. So they're being used to deliver services directly, to offer people advice when they're in need, to engage with supporters. And we are also starting to see the beginning of people being able to give to charity through them. So Amazon has allowed donations through its Alexa platform. And this, to me, raises a fascinating question about what philanthropic giving looks like in a future where the choices are determined by algorithms. And through the work I've been doing, I think there are two interesting ways this could go. One is to take the model already used by commercial platforms like Facebook or Amazon and to give people choices based on their past behavior and preferences and what their peer group has done. And I think that immediately raises some questions about whether it just reinforces a bias towards large organizations and well-known causes. And then the more intriguing possibility, I think, for the future is the idea that you could almost take the human element entirely out of the equation and use machine learning to analyze both data on needs and on social impact and have an entirely rational matching of the two, which is not always a popular idea when I bring it up, it has to be said. And then finally, in this last section, what I just want to do is give a few examples of the ways in which technology is starting to create new problems and what the civil society response might be. So one of the big problems that we're already seeing around artificial intelligence is the idea of bias. So algorithms themselves are not biased, but when they are put to work on data sets that contain historical bias for things like race or gender, unfortunately they start to demonstrate and strengthen those biases quite quickly. And we've seen this play out in the criminal justice system in the US and in policing in the UK and in lots of other places. And this will be a challenge, I think, for all of us in the future. As well as the unintended negative impact of artificial intelligence, another thing that we've already heard about, and I'm sure we'll hear more about, is the intended use of the technology to undermine civic discourse through things like targeted fake news, propaganda, and misinformation designed to destabilize electoral processes. And it's worth saying things, unfortunately, might be able to get much worse. I don't know if people are aware of the phenomenon of deepfakes, which is where you can use artificial intelligence to generate video content that is indistinguishable from real content, So you can produce a video of a politician saying whatever you want them to say, and it will be very difficult for anybody to know that. And the challenge for civil society will be firstly that it will be very hard to maintain authenticity when it comes to advocacy. So trust might decline further. But I think also we need to face up to the fact that we all have a role to play in combating this erosion of the notion of truth online. And I think this highlights a broader problem, again, which is the way in which the internet has created an economy based around one commodity, which is our attention. So the Nobel Prize-winning economist Herbert Simon first raised the idea in the 70s that when content becomes freely available, actually the thing that is scarce is our ability to pay attention to it. And the fact that organizations are battling over our attention is, I think, what is creating a lot of problems in the world today, because it incentivizes things like producing more extreme content, or making the apps and the interfaces and platforms that we use play into addictive behaviors. And the people who built them are now admitting this problem and holding their hands up and saying they must do something. And the question for all of us in civil society is how we compete for people's attention without contributing to that harm. And I just finally want to zoom out very quickly to a much larger scale question that sits at a societal level, and that is the issue of inequality. It's already one of the defining issues of our time, and I think there's a very important question as we discuss the development of technology in terms of whether it is a solution or a partial solution to inequality, or it makes the problem worse. So think, for instance, about the impact of automation on the workplace. We're told a lot that the future of work is going to be one in which all of our jobs look different and many traditional jobs and entire industries will disappear. And the impact of this, I think, will be felt unequally between the developed and developing world, between urban and rural populations, and between different demographics within society. So it's going to create new dimensions of inequality. And I just want to say, finally, that I think the question of how we in civil society or the philanthropy world engage with technology is not necessarily about getting to grips with the fine details of specific technologies, although that's very important and often very interesting. I think really it's more about understanding what some of these key macro trends are, how they could affect us as organizations, and how they could affect the people and communities that we are supposed to be serving. I don't have all the answers, unsurprisingly, but I just want, with my final slide, to leave you with some examples of the sorts of questions I think we need to be asking ourselves and the technology industry and government, and I think we need to be doing that now, not in a few years' time, because my worry is by that point it may well be too late. Thank you very much. Obrigado.
That was a little bit too much, I can say. But anyway, I'm going to open, I'm going to speak in English because he has not the earphones, so everyone who needs translation. So I'll open up with a question, and I'm taking questions from the audience. So if anyone, there is a paper on the table, so you can write. Por favor, se alguém quiser mandar uma pergunta, é só escrever no papel e levantar a mão que alguém vai pegar e traz aqui para mim. From what I understood, you were worried about how technology is going to increase inequality. It's one of the quick questions of this forum. So is technology going to increase or decrease inequality? With that in mind, for a country like Brazil, we have a poorly educated population. Mm-hmm. So where do you think that our philanthropists, our private social investors should focus on to avoid that Brazil is left behind?
I think, can everybody hear me? Yes. I think I highlighted the challenge of technology making the problem of inequality worse, but as with everything to do with technology, I don't believe that is inevitable. I think the question is what we all do about it now to ensure that technology can be a force for reducing inequality rather than making it worse. And there are some really encouraging examples. So, for instance, there are projects using blockchain technology to try and increase financial inclusion and to bring people who previously haven't been able to get into mainstream banking into the banking system. And I also think around the question of automation, again, it isn't inevitable that we have to just give in to the idea that all of our jobs will be replaced by robots or computers, and then all of us will be out of work. The question is how we manage that transition and what role civil society and philanthropy can play in helping people and communities who might be affected to find new ways of adapting, so to develop new skills and kind of new models for doing things that don't rely on traditional industries or traditional notions of work. And that seems to me exactly what philanthropy and civil society is for. In previous industrial revolutions, philanthropy played a massive role in making sure that some of the worst excesses of development weren't felt by everyone, so stopping children working in factories or unsafe working practices. And I think what we need is a modern version of that same ideal.
And what about civil society organizations, the NGOs, that struggles to fundraise for current activities and normally do not have capital to invest in technology and such advances? Or how do you think that is going to be the world for NGOs? And do you think that these new philanthropists, that many of them were born in Silicon Valley and in the tech industry, do you think they are going to be the ones who are going to provide the capital for technological advances in the non-profit world?
I hope so, and the optimist in me thinks that. I think there is a lot of enthusiasm in the technology world and a lot of philanthropy coming out of Silicon Valley, as you say. My only concern sometimes is that a lot of the activity bypasses traditional civil society. So people from that Silicon Valley background with a disruptive mindset see themselves as problem solvers, and that's great. But sometimes I think they don't necessarily value the long history and expertise that civil society can bring to the table in addressing social problems. So I think there is a lot more to be done in bringing those two worlds together. And I think that's also true in terms of the positive side of all of us in civil society using these technologies. You're right, it's totally unrealistic to expect that most, if any, civil society organizations have the money or skills to build big blockchain pilots or implement AI themselves. So
there is the risk involved.
And there is the risk. And I think both the resource and the risk needs to be managed through partnership with the tech industry, potentially with government. I think philanthropists and funders who understand technology and come from that background can also play a huge role. But it will be about bringing those worlds together to work on shared problems and goals.
And the ethical issue that was brought to society by technology. Do you think that the philanthropic community could play a neutral role in determining the boundaries, the ethical boundaries
of the development of technology? I think so, absolutely, and I think at the moment it is a bit of a gap. There's quite a well-developed debate in the UK and other places about AI ethics and the broader ethics of technology, and I've been involved to some extent through my work in that, but often I've found myself the only traditional civil society or charity voice in the room. The conversation is being led by the technology industry, a little bit by government and academia, and they're all, I think, very well-meaning and doing it for the right reason, but I think there is a unique civil society perspective and expertise.
Governments may have some interests in
as the technology industry might, and I think it's not even necessarily that they have bad intentions. the technology industry, their starting point usually is, obviously we need to do this. So there's not even a question of should we even do this in the first place, which sometimes that should be the starting point. You know, just because we can, should we, rather than how do we? And so I think we really do need to get the traditional civil society voice into that debate.
So, anyone would like to make a question? There is one question there. Before I take the question, what is your favorite technology application for within the philanthropic world?
Ooh, okay. Do you want me to answer it now? Obviously, I'll say because Alice are in the room, I absolutely love Alice, but it's easier. I think there are some fascinating. I've been doing a lot of work recently on sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I think the one there that I didn't explain. So Parkinson's UK, a charity in the UK that works to address Parkinson's disease, has a project with a hospital and an AI startup called Benevolent AI, and they are taking data from smartphones held on in people's pockets on micro movements of the body and applying machine learning to that to detect patterns of unnatural movement that can potentially diagnose the onset of Parkinson's disease much earlier than was previously possible. So I think there's some fascinating stuff going on.
Fascinating. So, question from the audience? There is one here.
Yes, here, on your right here. I just learned that the French schooling system just recently banned the use of smartphones for the kids at school, which means that the kids are going to be like 8 hours a day at least, without access to their smartphones. Do you think this is going to have does this mean that they're recognizing that this technology may not be so good in the learning process? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting challenge because there are definitely those who say that's trying to hold back the tide and, you're fighting a losing battle, because actually the reality is we're all going to have to just develop a better relationship with technology, and pretending it's not there is futile. Although I suppose the argument on the other side is a lot of people who develop these technologies and work in Silicon Valley don't let their own children use them, and I think perhaps that's quite telling.
So a question over there.
Rhodri, eu sei... Por favor, você traduz depois,
Yes,
Paula?
yes.
Ok. Nós sabemos que tem gap aumentando entre as pessoas que têm acesso à tecnologia e as pessoas que não têm acesso à tecnologia vão ficando para trás. Quer traduzir?
Quer. So we know that there is the existing gap between who has access to technology and who doesn't is widening.
Essa espécie de gap também não pode acontecer entre as organizações da sociedade civil, ou seja, aquelas que conseguem ter os recursos para acessar a tecnologia no seu trabalho e aquelas que vão ficando para trás porque elas não têm acesso aos recursos tecnológicos nem para o seu trabalho, nem para a captação de recursos?
And this gap could also be applied to the NGO world. So the ones that have access to the technology and to the resources to buy the technology, and the ones who doesn't, and especially in fundraising.
I think that is a concern, and I certainly would worry if technology created more of a gap between small organizations and large. When I was talking about the possibility of giving through voice-operated assistance, that's one area where I do think if we don't think carefully about how technology is applied, without realizing it, what will happen is it will just make it easier and easier for already well-known large organizations to fundraise, and smaller ones won't even be able to cut through at all. So it's definitely a concern. I think the positive side is that actually as some of these technologies become more widespread, the really key thing with their adoption is that they come down to a level of cost where real people can use them, not just that tiny group of early adopters. And actually, if you think about something like social media,
for all of its flaws and the problems that it raises, as a small organization now, or even as a single person, you can amplify your message, your campaigning, and project yourself using social media, blogs, podcasts, video, in a way that was impossible 15 years ago. And if done right, it doesn't have to cost that much money.
I'll speak in Portuguese, okay? It's because we're coming to the end. Actually, we started a little late, and infelizmente eu vou ter que encerrar aqui a conversa com ele. O Rhodri vai estar o dia inteiro aqui e está à disposição também para conversar com quem tiver interesse em aprofundar essa conversa. Thank you, Rhodri. Wonderful.
Thank you. Obrigado.